Hello and welcome to episode 37 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we are going to be taking a look at the in-game photo mode. Now we are just in a practice session at the Daytona International Speedway. We're going to be actually driving the road course, and we're in the Ligier LMP2 car, the Nissan version of the car. That is going to be our focus subject that we're going to be taking photos of for this tutorial and for this episode. And as you can see, we've got it at dusk settings just to make the kind of the general lighting and the background, the sky, a little bit more pretty and a little bit more dramatic for our photos. Now what I'm actually doing is just driving onto the track, and what I'm going to do is pause the game somewhere along the line to make an interesting photo here. We should do it right there at the apex of turn 2. Now you can actually access the photo mode from the pause menu and also the replay as well. If you go into the view replay option, there's a little button here that allows you to go into the photo mode. But what I'm actually going to do is go into the photo mode from where we are currently situated and positioned on track, and we'll talk about the various different options here and go through them to allow you to get the best possible pictures in game. So we have at the top right here a whole bunch of various different options that we could cycle through, and there's a different tab here as well that allows you to edit your photos a little bit and put a bit more stylistic choice onto your photos to kind of make them your own. There's at the top here we've got three main camera types. So we've got the cockpit camera, which is obviously situated in the actual cockpit of the car. We've got the trackside camera, which will use whatever camera is being used in the replay at the time. So obviously as the car moves around the circuit, it will cycle through the various different replay cameras. If you go into the photo mode on a particular camera, the trackside camera is going to be the one that is going to be used in the replay at that particular time. It's obviously depending on whereabouts in the replay the car is actually situated and what camera is being used at the time at that current time. And then we've got one more camera, the drone camera, which is probably the one that is most used by most people, where you are pretty much free to move around the environment and change the orientation and whereabouts the camera is actually looking, and basically pretty much position the camera wherever you'd like. Now with the cockpit camera and also the trackside camera, you can't change the camera's physical position, but what you can do is look around. So say with the trackside camera, I don't really want to focus on the car. Instead, I want to have a look at the grandstands in the background. Obviously, I can move the camera and change it to look up to the grandstands. I can also tilt the camera left and right as well using the E and R keys on the keyboard, and it is the left analog stick clicked down and the right analog stick click down to rotate the camera or tilt the camera left and right. For looking around with the mouse and keyboard, it's pressing and holding the right mouse button, and then obviously dragging the mouse around to move the camera around, and it is the right analog stick on the controllers to look around the environment. And then you can zoom in and out using the right trigger and left trigger. It'll be L2 and R2 on the PlayStation 4, and you can also do it with the mouse as well, with using the scroll wheel to zoom in and out. But it does also actually change the focal length option, as you can see here. It changes that, and you can just adjust the slider if you really wanted to as well to basically produce the same effect. Now when it comes to the drone camera, obviously you have a lot more freedom, like I said, so you can move around the environment using the W, A, S and D keys as you would in a first-person shooter when you're using a keyboard. And it is the left analog stick, moving that up, down, left, right will move the camera forwards, back and left and right. And then you can also actually change the height position of the camera as well. So you can move it down using the left bumper button and the right bumper button. We'll move the camera back up, which will be L1 and R1 on your PlayStation controller, and it is Q and Z on the keyboard to move the camera up and down. And of course you've got all the other functions of being able to zoom in and out, tilt the camera, and also being able to look around when it comes to the drone camera. Now with the drone camera, there are limitations as to how far away from your car, you can actually move the drone camera. There's a certain range. It is quite large, so you can move away a fair distance from it, but you won't be able to get too far, and it is also limited by the trackside scenery. So for example, the barriers here with the tire walls, I can't go beyond those, even if I move the camera up and try to go beyond them and go up over them, I won't be able to do that. So the barriers around the edge of the track are going to be your basically your movement limitation points, but you can pretty much move the camera around as you wish, as you can see here, and basically position it wherever you would like to try and get your own stylistic choice. So for example, I like to try and go for basically camera angles that are relatively realistic. So I tend to position my camera at the side of the track, for example here, over at the barrier, focus on the car, and then adjust the focal length to basically get the car nicely in shot with a decent composition, say something like that. Zoom it out a little bit more to get a bit more of the background in, and kind of go for a more realistic, as if I'm actually stood there in the environment taking the picture. Other people may go for a more cinematic shot. So for example, they may position their camera like here on the apex, zoom out a little bit and try and go for a more cinematic kind of shot, something like this, and try and get nice angles with that. Other people may go for kind of helicopter shots, so being high up in the sky and looking down on the environment and the cars racing and trying to get a group of cars in the shot. What I actually do for this, explaining the various different options here, I'll just keep this camera angle in this spot here. It's quite a nice position actually, and got the car quite nicely in basically in the composition of the image. So we've got a whole bunch of options. The first one is Aperture, which essentially allows you to choose the range of distance of the objects that will appear in focus. So using lower values will only have the objects that are close to the camera's position in focus, whereas if I was to up the aperture, obviously you can see the background is starting to come a lot more into focus as well. What we'll actually do is go and smack that somewhere around there. So we've got the car quite nicely in focus, but the background is quite nicely softly blurred and out of focus. So the focus of the image is mainly on the car here in the foreground. Now your focal length, that is essentially your zooming in and out, as it were. So you can zoom the camera right out using a low focal length, and then increasing it will allow you to zoom in further. And it kind of works similar to F.O.O.L in a way. It's basically adjusting the F.O.O.L, but also the zoom of the camera as well. So as you saw, just seen that in action. And then your focus distance, actually choose where the sharp point of focus is in the scene in relation to the camera. So moving it to a lower value will bring this focal distance much closer to the camera. So if you look down here at the very bottom of the image, you can see that the curbs, or part of the curb, is a lot more in focus, whereas the car and background is quite heavily out of focus. However, if I move this focal distance further away, you can see we're now brought the car into focus. The curbs in the immediate foreground are out of focus and the background are still out of focus, and I can continue to move the focus distance beyond the car to focus on the background. So the tyre barriers over on the left hand side of the car are now in focus, and also so is the marquees and the general facilities and trackside scenery is now more in focus. But we'll bring this back to our car so that is nicely in focus round about there. That looks good to me. Now, bouquet shape. This basically allows you to adjust how soft the out of focus edges are. So if you set this to 0, it's going to turn off pretty much all the depth of field effects, and out of focus elements will become in focus. However, putting it on will essentially change how soft the blurred the edges of the blurred scenery is actually in the game. So the higher the number, the softer they actually become. It all basically changes the number of blades used on the aperture. It's all quite technical sort of thing, but the effect is very, very minor. It is there. It is really quite soft. But it can be noticeable in some of the really high quality shots as well. Now, shutter speed basically allows you to determine the amount of motion blur in a photo. Putting this down to a lower shutter speed is going to increase the motion blur. This mainly affects the wheels. As you can see, the wheels are now very, very nicely blurred, and is quite a serious sense of speed. Whereas if I go and actually increase the shutter speed to a much faster rate, the wheels become a lot more in focus, and as if the shutter speed was really, really quick, so it'll be less blurring. So what we'll actually do is go and adjust this to around about there. So it looks like there is some rotation in the wheel, and there is a little bit of sense of speed, but there's nothing too dramatic. Now, your tracking speed, this one's a little bit finicky and kind of very much depends on the whereabouts you've positioned the camera. It only really works from certain angles, but it basically allows you to control how closely the camera is tracking the car. So if you were, for instance, to put a negative number towards the tracking speed, essentially it would act as if you weren't tracking the car fast enough, and then if you were to set it to 0, it'll be basically perfectly tracking the car, as the car was basically passing you and you were panning the camera around. And then obviously increasing it to a higher positive number will act as if you were tracking the car too quickly. So it'll drag some of the blur elements, and it's a little bit finicky. It isn't really working in this camera angle, so it's pretty difficult to actually demonstrate it. And trying to find the right camera angle will probably take a little bit of time to actually show off the tracking speed as well. But it's quite a nice, neat little feature that kind of adds a little bit of more of a kind of almost like an amateur sort of element to the photo that you're taking. But either way, I'm going to position this camera just here. So we've got basically the camera, all the various different settings as if you were adjusting those on the camera now actually set up. And then you've got a whole bunch of options here which are kind of almost like a post-editing sort of effect. So once you've taken the as if you're taking this photo in real life and you've gone back to, say, Photoshop or GIMP or Lightroom or something like that, and you're using 2D photo editing software to enhance the image a little bit more. Just quickly before I go on to those, there's a number of things that you can also actually do. Obviously, if you're very, very happy with the picture that you have right now, you can actually take the photo, which will be left click with mouse and keyboard, or pressing A or X on your controllers. That will allow you to take the photo. You can also hide the UI elements, so you can see the composition of your shot as well. As you can see here, we've got it quite nicely positioned. I'm very happy with the overall composition and the general focus of the car being heavily in focus and the main focal point, but the background is quite nicely out of focus. That kind of emphasizes and enhances the car a little bit more as well. And obviously you can hide the UI, double check that the photo is looking good before actually taking it, and then pressing X on the controller, that's on the Xbox controller, or pressing square on the PlayStation controller will allow you to switch between the camera controls and then the photo editing controls. And obviously with a mouse and keyboard, you just click on the two tabs up here. Now the first option is a photo filter, and at the moment we don't have any filters applied, but as you can see, as I cycle through the various different filters, there's also all sorts of different photo filters that you can actually apply to your image as well to get various different stylistic effects. When you have a photo filter applied, I'm actually going to go with that one for now, a nice warm bleach. You also have the filter intensity. Having it at 100% will have the photo filter that you have chosen in full effect. If I was to go ahead and drop the intensity, it will essentially remove the photo filter as well. So if I say go somewhere, I actually quite like it at 100% with that one. It gives a nice sharp crisp. The blacks are nice and dark and crisp, whereas if I go and drop it, it kind of washes out the darker elements of the image. The blacks aren't as sharp or as deep and seem to be a lot more grey, and the image just generally seems to be a little bit more washed out. So we'll keep the filter intensity at 100% for this one. Your vignette option basically darkens up the edges of the image. So obviously, as you can see there, you can see a lot of black creeping in up at the four corners of the image, and this kind of just helps to kind of emphasize the center of the image a little bit more. So going with something slightly stylistic, if we go ahead and put that to 45%, you can see some nice soft edges of the black coming up in the four corners of the image. Obviously, it's a lot more noticeable on the sky rather than down in the bottom corners of the image where it's on the surface of the ground and track. Frame allows you to bring in a black frame around the image, so if you want, you can have a really narrow frame, something like that, or you can bring it up so it kind of looks more like an old TV set or a really old photo, and kind of just frame the center of the image a lot more. I'm actually going to bring this down quite a bit to, let's go 2%. There's barely a frame that's actually come into the edges there, but it's just kind of, it's emphasized the vignette a little bit more around those edges as well. Obviously, contrast, you can adjust that. That will make the depth of colors a lot sharper. So obviously, in this case, it's bringing in a lot more black. It's making it a lot deeper and generally darkening the image a fair amount. I'm going to leave that on 0%. Exposure allows you to adjust essentially how much light passed through the lens. So if I want, I can really darken the image here and kind of create a more moody and deep image, or I can expose the image up a lot more and make it a lot brighter, so the sky has become overexposed. As you can see, there's no detail in it, but the darker areas of the car have become a lot brighter. So you can adjust that as well. I'm going to leave that around 95% actually. Saturation basically allows you to adjust how much color is in the image. So using a low saturation value will turn it into pretty much a grayscale image, as you can see here, and then putting the saturation back up to 100% will allow the full color. You can go something that's in between, slightly more stylistic, kind of say 50%. So the red of the car in this case here isn't shining through quite as hard, and it's taking quite a bit of the color out of the image. You then also got film grain as well, which basically puts a grain effect onto the photo that you're going to be taking, and kind of goes with a more old style approach. A lot of the old cameras back in the old days would have had quite a bit of film grain in them. They don't have the quality of the SLRs and the HD cameras that you have these days, where everything is really nice and sharp. So you can put a little bit of a film grain on it if you want to kind of go for a more old school approach. And then chromatic aberration. This is basically an effect caused by the failing of the lens to focus all colors to the same convergence point. So at the moment it's set to 0%, but if I was to go ahead and actually increase this, what you can see is there's a lot of blurring, and also the colors haven't really quite matched up to the exact same point around the car. If I was to bring it back in, you can see that basically the colors kind of shift and move away from each other. It's obviously a lot more emphasized as you increase the chromatic aberration, but you can get some nice cool effects with it. Obviously, as the further you go away from the center of the image, the greater the effect is. But I'm going to leave that down at 0%. I'm actually going to see if I can find another filter to use. Rusty effect, sepia, none. So at the moment we've got the saturation down that would have been basically what it looked like in game. Obviously, I don't have a filter applied. I'm going to see if I can find a nice one. That's quite a nice one. I might drop the intensity of it though, just a little bit, to bring something a little bit more unique coming in, liking the frame, liking the contrast. Bring the exposure up just a little bit more to 110% in this one, and then just going to hide the UI. And that is, say, a photo that I can end up taking that image, and that is essentially how you use the in-game photo mode. I'm actually going to go ahead and reposition the camera to another angle and quickly set up and take another photo. Let's go position the camera over here. So what we could do is something pretty cool and stylistic. Quite like the aperture. We can do something like this where we're looking like just over the tire wall. At the moment you can see that the car is quite heavily out of focus. If we move the aperture up a little bit and then increase the focal distance to somewhere around there. Actually, I'm not going to do it over the tyres. And then move it to there. And then what we could do is zoom in the car quite a lot. Position it there. Adjust the focal length so we've got the car quite nicely in focus. Quite liking that. I'm not going to get any tracking speed. What I may actually do is blur the background a little bit more to somewhere around there. And then we've got another photo composition here. Whilst you've got the UI hidden, you can also still move the camera around. But we can do something like that. And then we could take another photo. And then if you want to go and actually view the screenshots or the photos that you've actually taken, if you come back out to the main menu, I'll just show you very, very quickly. Come into the My Profile, and then under the images, you have all the photos that you've taken here. So this is the latest one that we've just taken. As you can see, it works rather nicely, or looks rather nice. And then we can view this one here as well. And as you can see, there's various other photos that I have taken over time, taking photos of the track, for example, something simple like that, or going ahead and taking action photos of cars at Bathurst and other cool little images. So that is how you use, that one's a really nice one as well, the Renault Clio Cup car up on two wheels, hooning it around Brands Hatch, and that one for another example. So the photo mode that you can use in Project Cars 2 is very, very powerful. You can create all sorts of different styled photos. Obviously the community has been taking plenty of photos, and the official Twitter account for Project Cars game has also been sharing a lot of the community photos as well. If you fancy having a go, obviously take what you've seen from here, apply them with your own stylistic choices in terms of positions and filters and effects and things like that, and see what kind of photos that you can come up with and showcase the action of racing that you've come across in Project Cars 2. Obviously, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try and get back to you as soon as I possibly can. If you've been enjoying the content that's been going up on the channel, then feel free to consider subscribing to the channel as well. Very much appreciate that. Also very much appreciate people sharing the video. But other than that, thank you very much for watching this episode of the Insider's Guide series. Hopefully I shall catch you again next week in the next episode. But in the meantime, have fun and take care.